Well, I'm very happy to introduce Nancy Furlotti to our audience. She is going to be the speaker for the 2020 Zurich Lecture Series. And I'm going to speak with her today for a bit about the theme of those lectures and the origin, the contents, and the complications that came about in the creating of these lectures, and why it's Nancy and not Ariel Shalat, who actually was the original author and the author of most of it. Nancy has completed the text, and she'll tell us the story of that in a moment. The lectures will be entitled A Story of Dreams, Fate, and Destiny, authored by Ariel Shalit and presented by Nancy Furlotti. So let me begin, Nancy, and just ask you a little bit about yourself. If you want to tell the audience who you are, where you're trained, where you live, just to give them a little background about Nancy Furlotti.
Okay. Well, I trained at the C.G. Jung Institute of Los Angeles, and actually at the same time, I overlapped that training with training at the Centrum in Zurich, which is the Center for Depth Psychology according to von Franz and C.G. Jung, but actually was certified in LA. I'm living now in Aspen, Colorado, and but I lived for most of my life in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. I was a founding member of the Philemon Foundation. Mm-hmm. And
you were the president for a time of the Philemon Foundation, yes.
I was. And then I transitioned out of that position, and now I'm on a number of other boards, one of which I'm very happy to be on, which is the Mercurius Film Committee that Mary, you're also on.
That's right, yes.
And that's a really fun project. Mm-hmm. I'm also a board member of Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara, actually Carpinteria. And I'm very interested in mythology, in dream work, in the darker emanations of the psyche, in anthropology. Mm-hmm. And that interest has taken me to Guatemala, where I'm a board member of an archaeological foundation that is doing archaeological work and research in very early Maya civilizations down there. And I'm also on the board of the Kairos Film Foundation, which has the films A Matter of Heart and The World Within, and the 36 Remembering Young videos that were produced back in the 70s and 80s by Suzanne and George Wagner. So what else? Oh, important, very important, is the fact that Ariel Shalit and I started a company a number of years ago to publish first generation Jungian analysts' unpublished works. And we've recently completed an original manuscript by Erich Neumann that was written during World War II, shortly after he emigrated from Berlin to Palestine. And it's called The Roots of Jewish Consciousness. And we've also, I guess it's me now, published Alfred Reeve's book on alchemy, which is a very interesting book too.
Well, this is a good segue, I think, into the topic of Ariel Shalit and his work. And what you'll be presenting in the Zurich Lecture Series is his 11th book, actually, and his final book. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you became involved in this project and how it came about that you will now be presenting the work that I spoke with him maybe 5 years ago about presenting a lecture, a series at Zurich, and he agreed at that time enthusiastically, and then life took its course, and you
Mhm.
stepped gratefully, in my opinion, into the picture and will give us his completed work. Can you just say something about Ariel and introduce him to the audience as well?
Yes, and it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of you people out there who will be listening to this know Ariel in one way or another. He was a fabulous teacher, analyst, lecturer, writer, friend. Um, he was a Jungian analyst in Israel, and at one point was the president of his institute there. And as you said, Murray, he's written 11 books. He was a prolific writer. That's what he absolutely loved to do.
Mm.
And he wrote books from, of course, a Jungian perspective, but also from historical, mythological, from comparative religious perspectives also. And they crossed a wide spectrum of interests, from political interests to what's going on with regards to all this new advancing technology, to now where we are with this book on dreams. And this is,
Well, you did write a book with him earlier on dreams, didn't you? The two of you co-authored a book, I believe.
we
Yeah.
did, the dream and its amplification.
Mm-hmm.
And in that book, it was an edited book. We both contributed chapters to that book, and of course
Yeah.
the introduction and the conclusion. But we invited a number of other analysts to talk about how they work with dreams. So it was kind of a fundamental how to work with dreams from a Jungian point of view, with a lot
Mm-hmm.
of examples. This book is contains a lot of the a lot of the information, the foundational information about how to work with dreams. But the way he has written it, and it focuses on the dream primarily, because the dream uh, is the way we communicate with the unconscious. The dream is the language of the unconscious that allows us to, for example, discover what our fate is, which he shows through history has been the case by looking at specific dreams. And so we have this wonderful back and forth communication between consciousness and the unconscious through the dream. And so he starts with that, and he starts way back with Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh's first dream, the very first dream that was ever written down. And he takes us through history, and he weaves in different stories, different cultures, different attitudes about working with dreams, and touches on the idea of fate as
Mm-hmm.
one discovers in the dreams, and whether people pay attention to that and heed the warnings of the psyche or not, and what happens throughout history with all the important characters throughout history.
Mm-hmm. Well, that, is a topic that isn't much discussed in our present culture, the idea of fate. I mean, we mostly think we make our own fate. We're ego oriented. We make our choices and we think we're in control and so on. So the very idea of fate and destiny, and maybe you can distinguish what the difference between fate and destiny, but that's somehow available to us through our dreams, that we have a fate, we have a destiny.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a fate, and that is exactly what he is presenting in this series of lectures, or that will also be a book. He presents evidence to show that throughout history, so many people have been faced with big dreams that lay out their fate. And then since we humans do have the freedom to make choices about which way we take it, which way we go, then he also shows us what happens in a lot of these cases with the decisions that are made, whether the fate is accepted or not, whether it's made conscious or not, whether it's fought against or not, and how these individuals end up. And that would be how they live their destiny. Destiny is how we take that fate and how we decide to live that forward in a positive way or not a positive way.
It's kind of chilling to think, though, that I may have a fate that I don't like. I mean, I may have a fate that really looks pretty bad to me, from an ego point of view anyway, and I don't want it, and I would resist it if I knew about it. What happens if you fight your fate? If you decide that is definitely not what you want?
Well, as Arel talks about in his first chapter, he talks about Nebuchadnezzar, for example.
That's right, yeah.
He did not heed the writing on the wall, and it was a disaster. Somebody else who knew his fate, Xenopus, of course, that's another story, very interesting relating to fate. He had a terrible fate. And he was so kind of driven by that fate that he didn't make the right decisions in order to avoid some of the catastrophes. That's a good example of how strong fate can be. But we all have a fate. We're all born with certain characteristics. We're all born in a certain situation that sets us up with our own fate.
Do you think that analysis can make a difference? Can it, in a sense, free us from our fate? In the sense of fate as something that is implacable, that is unchangeable, that is, you're just completely locked into a pattern. Would analysis have an effect on that if we make it conscious?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the first step is to pay attention to what the dreams are telling you, which will lay out your fate. And that could also be said as being your myth. What is your myth? Jung talks about that, about his struggle in finding what his myth was. Now, he obviously came into this world with a strong fate. And then finding one's myth helps you live your fate. There are certain things that you're not going to be able to avoid in your own personality. You can't get rid of certain things. We have complexes. We never get rid of the complexes. We become conscious of our complexes, and we live with them, and we carry them consciously, and then we make decisions about how we act those complexes out. And of course, we know behind the complexes are the archetypes. So certain archetypes are constellated in each individual at a very, very young age. And then we live those patterns throughout our life. And that could be seen as our fate. Certain constellation corresponds to our uniqueness. And so we have that propelling us forward, but then we also have freedom of choice to decide how we express that. And through the dreams, we are constantly getting information from the psyche as to what step to take when we come to a crossroads, for example, which of course is where Hermes resides. we have to make a choice. Do we go straight? Do we go left, right? Do we stand still, go backwards? We have that choice.
Mhm.
And the dream is the way we can get help in guiding us in our choices, make better choices than, than to make unconscious choices, or choices out of fear, or choices out of, it would be strictly related to our ego.
Yeah.
Dream helps us make choices that go past the ego and help us perhaps those choices lead us in a direction that we wouldn't necessarily consider a positive way to go, but in the long run, it is the positive way to go. And so that's why it's so important to pay attention to the heeding of that psychic voice, that very quiet psychic voice.
Did you have the feeling that in writing this book, Ariel was following his destiny, that he was in touch with a sense of his fate, and he was making the choices that resulted in this particular work? Was this a part of his destiny?
I would say that it is. I would say that it is. I think it was a process for him in making sense of it all, to tell you the truth. After he died, and I don't know, I'll share with the audience here the fact that he unfortunately contracted esophageal cancer and suffered with that for close to 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And ended up dying from that. But long before that, he had had dreams that pointed in that direction, that his fate would be foreshortened, his life would be foreshortened.
Oh, really? Mm-hmm.
And so there was a certain conscious knowledge of that, and of course, let's say 10 years before he actually developed cancer, there were indications in his dreams that dark figures from the other side were coming, and helpful figures from the other side were coming in his dream to visit him. And consciously, of course, you want to push that away. You want to interpret that in a different way. You don't want to see that. But clearly, in retrospect, you can see this pattern. And he would always say to me, I don't understand why I have such a huge percentage of patients who contract cancer or come to me with cancer, and quite a large number of them end up dying.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought that was unusual too. And of course, what is that saying? What does that mean? It must have been a beginning preparation for himself. And so unconsciously, he knew what was going on. Consciously, I'm not so sure he wanted to know. But he got to a certain point where he knew, and we would actually kind of talk around these things a bit. So there were a lot of conversations that had to do with dying. And of course, one of the things he was very interested in, concerned about, sad about, was the experience of his family, the experience of the world in the Holocaust.
Oh, yes.
He lost a lot of family members in the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And so that was a pervasive sense of loss and death, and trying to understand that horror for himself. A certain amount of carrying a guilt, kind of a collective guilt around that himself. So so it wasn't, these things don't come out of the blue. If you really look at some of the experiences, some of the dreams, some of your interests, it all kind of can be gathered together in terms of a certain certain fate
Yeah.
get lived out. You pull
Did,
all your interests together. And for him, I think that was the case. And then, of course,
yeah.
when he was diagnosed, then the situation became much more conscious. And he began seriously working with those images and actively engaging with this fate
Mhm.
and, and following his destiny.
And would you say that this book reflects that late process, a kind of summing up, putting the pieces together, seeing his own life in these terms of fate and destiny and the dreams and so on?
I think so. I think it was very helpful for him to kind of lay it all out in such a clear way
Yes.
and for himself, but in the reflection of all of these historical individuals who had these powerful dreams, who had potent fates, and it's just a wonderful exploration into how the decisions they made and how they lived their destinies and how they ended up.
Mhm.
I think for Aurel, he really embraced it
Yeah.
and he really worked with it, and and it's nothing but a tragedy. It's
Yes.
it's a tragedy for everybody left behind, a
Yes.
complete and utter tragedy for everybody left behind. Um, but for him, I think he got to the point where he was uh, he was happy to give up his body because his body just
Yeah. When
faded.
he accepted his destiny in a sense, in
He
that
did.
sense. When you picked up the pieces after his death and you started working with the manuscript that he left behind, how much was left to complete? How much did you have to fill in after he put it in your hands?
Well, he had 6 lectures that he had given at various places. Um, and they all have PowerPoint presentations. So they're all beautiful lectures. And
Mm,
the work I've been doing over the last year or so is to pull those lectures into chapters.
I see.
As you know, we've got to pull this into a book too. So I've been working on the lectures to pull them into chapters, which is a different form. So that's
Sure.
taken quite a bit of time. And of course, when a person gives a lecture, they don't have to be so specific and detailed. So a lot of the footnotes were missing. A lot of the quotes, I had to do a lot of searching to find the references to the quotes. And he also um, he left pieces missing, and there were big questions, but he left notes, which
Mm,
is what he did with the other manuscript that I did end up completing, this
mm,
whole Lost in Transition at the Dawn of the New Era. He would leave notes for me. I'm not so sure this lecture should go here, or is it redundant? Or I want you to add something about Song of Songs and notes throughout. I want you to add this and maybe move this around. So he did go
left you a
through
lot of work.
and leave a lot of these suggestions. He didn't, of course, have the book form. He didn't have an introduction. He didn't have a conclusion. So it's been a process of trying to make this a cohesive whole,
Yes.
make it clear. He has a beautiful, very poetic writing style.
Yes.
Not mine. That's not the way I write. And I think that's because he always used to say he did not have a mother tongue. He was
Oh.
um, he was born and raised in Sweden. His parents spoke German and his father spoke Hebrew. And so he grew up with all of these languages. He started studying English very early on. And so he had a wonderful facility in terms of thinking about how he wants to say things. And I would always say to him, your sentences are so unusual that a native-born English speaker would never organize a sentence that way. But what it was for him was it was a form of poetry, and
I see, yeah.
that's how he writes. It was absolutely beautiful.
You
So,
didn't change those sentences. You
no,
didn't.
no, no, no.
Put your,
No, I absolutely read his sentences. Um, and but the pieces, the hard part has to do with me filling in the pieces.
yeah.
I try to imitate his writing style a lot more than I would normally, because I don't want somebody to come to a certain passage and then all of a sudden have a completely
Yeah.
different writing style. So
That's a big challenge. In the lectures, will we hear your voice? I mean, how are you going to do this? Or will you just read his lectures, or
yes, I'm going to read his lectures.
you're going to read his lectures? So you will try to act the part of Ariel Shalit in Zurich. Yeah.
Yes, I will. I will be channeling
You'll
Ariel.
be channeling Ariel. Well, we're looking forward to it, and I'm sure it will be a very special Ariel that comes to us
Yes.
and presents these words that he leaves behind. You did. I wanted to just quote a sentence quickly before we stop. This is the last sentence of your preface, I believe, where you says, Ariel, always the patient, kind friend and teacher and analyst, leaves this inspiring book as a reminder of how short life is and how crucial it is to live it consciously, not only for our own sake, but for all of humanity and beyond. That's a very inspiring sentence that you wrote, I think.
Yes, I do.
A tribute to Ariel.
Yes,
Yes.
yes. And a very important reminder to all of us. He died when he was 67 years old.
Yes.
That was way too young, way too young. And we never know when our time's going to come. We
No.
don't know whether we're going to live nice, solid, long lives and get to the point where we are definitely ready to go, or whether our lives are going to be cut short.
Yeah.
And so it is so important to pay attention to the messages from our psyche through our dreams, through our visions, to understand our fate and to make our own choices to live that destiny the way we want to live that destiny, to leave the legacy we want to leave.
In the years that we have.
In
Yes.
the years, however many those years are.
Yeah.
And he filled his up. He packed his short life.
He did. He was very intense and very determined to live it fully. Yes.
He was. He was.
Well, we will, I think, have his book published when you come here in end of September, early October to present the lectures.
Mm-hmm.
So the people who come and attend the lectures will have the experience of hearing you and the opportunity to buy his book on site as well. And I hope that people will take advantage of this opportunity. It's a very rare one to come and hear you present these words of your dear friend, Ariel Shalit. Thank you, Nancy.
And his PowerPoints are gorgeous, too.
Thank you so much.
They're as unusual as his writing.
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Nancy.